Okay, that makes the top of the hour, so I'm going to go ahead and get us kicked off. I'd just like to say, first and foremost, thanks for joining in today. We put a lot of work into Knowify and into these trainings, and so it means a lot to us that you guys take some time out of your day to attend these sessions and learn a little bit more about how to use our software. And today's topic is on budgeting in Knowify. So, if anyone's very familiar with Knowify, you know that budgeting is a big part of what we do. Just being able to job cost and show that cost versus budget reporting at the job level ends up being very important. And so, we're going to be doing a deeper dive into creating budgets, different categories of budgeting, and things like that, all in our Knowify account. And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Terrin. I manage customer experience at Knowify. I've been doing this for about 10 years, and you may have spoken with me in the past because I have worked with just about every customer that's come through our door in some capacity or another. Um, and I don't know if I have any good fun facts about me today, but we'll go ahead and jump to our agenda. So we'll start by just kind of defining budgeting, what we mean when we say budgeting. Taking a little bit more of a dive into this concept of Knowify's budget functionality. Then we'll be defining the different types of costs that we can budget for, more categories. So as opposed to just, hey, the job should cost me $10,000, breaking down that $10,000 into labor, materials, subcontractors, and things like that. Then we'll also be covering some stuff around the plan and track section in Knowify, which, if you're familiar, is basically our job tracking and cost tracking center of any job in Knowify. And we'll be doing a demonstration inside my Knowify account. That's when I'll actually, instead of going through slides, pull up my account and show you a little bit more about how this is all done. And then we'll finish off with a Q&A at the end of this. If you have questions during this session, feel free to throw them in Zoom's Q&A little button in their functionality for that. I have my associate Vin, who's going to be answering some of the questions via text if they're shorter, quicker questions, and then we'll be answering some of these live after the webinar, just if it requires a little bit more long form of an answer. And I see the occasional hand being raised. For what it's worth, this is all going to be somewhat of a one-directional webinar rather than the Q&As that coming in. So we never take anyone off of mute. So if you have a question, just throw it in the chat there. So let me just kind of start with this high level, budget defined. What are we talking about when we talk about budget? The simplest definition here is estimated cost of completion. So how much do we think it's going to cost us to finish this job? We've heard budget used in a lot of other ways. So I guess when we are talking about budget as it pertains to managing jobs in Knowify, we're talking about your estimated cost to complete the job. So if I say, like we have this example in the screenshot, total cost budget is $25,942.40. That's how much I think, as the contractor, it's going to cost me to complete this job. Our budgets also are very fixed at this point in time. So we say it's your cost of completion. This is final cost at the end of the job. Here's the total amount we will have spent. We don't have a way to adjust the cost to complete as the scope of work changes really beyond adding phases. I'll cover a little bit more of that through the demonstration. But what's important to note here is that our budget isn't actual cost at any point in time. So we may use potential actual cost to build a budget. I may say I need to buy 10 of these and they cost $5 each, so I budget 50. But that $50 isn't an actual cost until there's additional things like purchase orders or bills, things like that that generate cost. It helps us then track that actual cost. So we could see in this example, I estimated or budgeted $6,700 for materials, and I've spent $6,140, so I'm under budget. But this is the idea here, is that the budget is a number for us to track the actual cost against. Our budget also isn't at any point in time really our contract. So that's another common misconception. People expect the budget to coincide with the amount in their contract, or they expect the budget to be um, the amount they end up invoicing, things like that. The idea here is that, again, this should be my internal cost, not the amount that the customer is budgeting at any point in time. And having a budget in again helps us track the cost more easily. So we'll go through some examples of this. But the idea is if I have a list of materials in my budget, then I can just order that list of materials instead of having to enter everything individually through the life of the job. And then it can also help us track project progress and WIP. So if I say that a job should cost me $25,000, then as I add cost against that 25,000, it shows me how far along we are on our spending compared to what we said we were going to end up spending. And a lot of times we use this as a way to understand percentage of completion. So if I've spent half of my budget, we have finished half of the job. And we know that it's not always true. Just for an oversimplification, that's just another place where budget comes in handy. Um, Next, I'll get into our different budget categories. And these are the different categories that are available in Knowify. I know there's a lot more categories that can be potentially budgeted, but as far as our software goes, and we're doing the webinar here, so we get to kind of call this out. These are the categories that we allow you to track. So the first one would be materials. And the simple explanation for materials is anything that's bought that is used on the job. So when I'm talking about materials, if I'm a framer, this is the lumber. If I'm a painter, it's the paint. If I'm an electrician, it's the wire. As opposed to things that I might need to buy that aren't burned on the job. So if I am a framer, I might need to buy a nail gun, but that's not a material for the job. That's where we start getting into equipment, because that's something I'm going to use on future jobs as well. So when we talk about materials, these are things that I'm buying from an outside party. These are things that I'm buying from a vendor that I'm using specifically on the job. It's bought for that job. Then we get into labor. And this is going to be my employee or resource time used on a job. As opposed to an interaction with a vendor where I give them money, they give me goods and services, this is I have someone who's on payroll or we're paying them hourly. Here's how much we're spending to have them work on the job based off of the hours that they submit. And we use what we call a loaded labor burden. So when we're tracking actual cost, we take the base rate of the employee and then any additional benefits they get, taxes, things like that. And it just tells us here's how much you're spending. But for the sake of this webinar, when we're talking about budgeting, this is how much we expect to spend on all of that. So I may not know who actually is tracking time when the job's live, but I could say we're going to need a foreman, and we usually spend $80 an hour on foreman time. Things like that help us build out labor budgets. So I could see how much time will we spend on the job, and how much will that time cost us potentially. Then we get into subcontractors, and these are going to be vendors that we're hiring to perform work on the job. So not labor cost in that it's not hourly cost that we pay or will pay, but this is actually how much I'm going to pay outside people to come work on this project. Generally working on contract. So instead of paying them hourly, most of the time when we're talking about contractors, we're saying, okay, I signed a $1,000 contract with you, so you're going to eventually make $1,000. I'm going to pay you that my cost will increase into $1,000. But again, when it comes to budgeting, we're saying, I think I will need to spend X number of dollars on subcontractor fees in order to complete this project. Then when we get to equipment, we're talking about, again, things that you may be renting or things that you may own that are used on the project that aren't materials that are burned on the project. So this is where we get into things like trucks, different types of heavy machinery, excavators, and it can be more granular if you want. It might be a ladder, something like that. Maybe less relevant to track a ladder for the sake of costing, but for the sake of knowing where it is, this is where equipment comes in handy. But for the sake of today's webinar, this is how much I'm going to spend on equipment, both rented and owned. So when we talk about owned equipment, job costing is kind of similar to labor in that it might just be a annual cost of owning that equipment, the same way I have an annual cost of keeping that employee hired. Uh, but then when we track the cost to the job, it's based off of an hourly rate that we determine for that equipment. And so when we talk about budgeting, it's I think I'm going to need this equipment on the job for this many hours. How much should that end up costing me? And then with rented equipment, it's a similar concept. It's actually going to be more like what we do in materials, where with rental equipment, we're talking about how much am I going to have to pay a vendor in order to rent this type of equipment for this long? Then our last category we have is miscellaneous. Miscellaneous is going to just be for anything that doesn't fit into the other categories. My go-to example is always things like permitting, where a permit's not a material, we're not paying a subcontractor, it's not really a piece of equipment, but it is something that we spend money on the job, and I want to know how much we spend on these things. And so we have the ability to budget for all of the different items that we don't have a way of categorizing with the other options available to us. Now, the different types of budgeting that we can do are lump sum and itemized. So, when we talk about lump sum, this is the idea of just assigning a dollar figure to a budget. So, if we look at the example in the screenshot for project 441, I have a materials budget of $4,000, a labor budget of $2,300. Um, and these are handy because they give us a number to track against. So, as I add more material cost, it's going to say, here's how much you've spent versus the 4,000 that you had budgeted. Um, and if we're trying to just quickly build a budget, there's nothing wrong with ever setting up a budget like this. But if we ever want to get more granular and a little bit more automation out of Knowify, we can look into creating itemized budgets. This is where we are setting up a budget where instead of just saying $2,760 for materials on framing, I can write in, I need to buy nails and lumber and strand board. Here's how many of them I need to buy. Here's how much they cost per unit. And have Knowify build out that materials budget dollar figure for me. So we still have the dollar figure to track against. We still want to know how much we actually ended up spending. But now I have it broken down to more detail. And instead of me just seeing if I went over or under my materials budget for framing, I can see if I went over or under my budget for nails, for lumber. Was it that I bought more items than I needed, or did they cost more than I expected? We can get way more granular with that type of information. And then we can also use that to create purchase orders to create allocations in the field, just speed up that process of getting that cost into the job. Same thing goes for labor, where I can always see the total labor budget, but I can also break it down and say this $8,970 labor budget is broken down into 40 foreman hours. What's my number here? 120 tradesman hours. I can really get granular with it. So then I can see how much did we actually end up spending, not just in a dollar figure, but also in a number of hours for this individual type of role. That way, as things change with time, as I end up paying employees more because of the increase in general labor cost, I don't need to always reference the dollar figures associated with the budget, but I can see how many hours does it take. Now I budget instead of this $70 an hour for foreman time, I budget 80, but I still want to budget the same number of hours. I still want to understand how many hours it's going to take. And that's where these itemized budgets really come in handy, is it's breaking down more than just, hey, here's the dollar figure, that's good enough. It's saying, here's the dollar figure and why. Here's the breakdown of what's going to end up happening on this job. When it comes to itemized budgets for equipment, we can actually do this as internal versus external. So that's the idea of my owned equipment versus rented equipment. When we talk about owned equipment, it's how many hours will I need to use my excavator that I own. When it's external, this is rented equipment. How much will it cost me to rent an excavator from United Rentals? Um, and then miscellaneous, similar type of workflow to materials where I just write an itemized list. I need to buy X, Y, and Z. Here's how many of them I need to buy and their unit cost per each. Now, when we go outside of our individual categories and we want to get a little bit more granular, Knowify has what we call phases. And this is our way of breaking down our budgets into more detail than just the generic, here's the total amount. Um, This way, if I have something that I want to track, the material, labor, sub, etc., if I want to track the individual breakdown of that at a more granular level, I can create a phase for each of these. So what was not just my material cost on the job, but my material cost of demolition on the job. So we're starting high level, the total budget $22,000. Then we could break it down into categories of that 22,000, 6,000 is materials. Then we break it down into phases. Out of that $6,000, 4,000 of it is materials for demolition. And that's really what we do use phases for, is to start by giving you that high level, but then drill down to the nitty-gritty details of what we're budgeting and what that actual cost is, so we can categorize and see where we spend more and less money than we expect at any point in time. Now that we're through the slides, I'll pull up my account and just walk through some different workflows and examples of all of this. So I'll create a new job, go add new contract job. And when I set up this job, I'm going to use the professional job costing style. Now, if you're unfamiliar with Knowify, the advantage of professional here is that we set up the budget first. So this is the idea of, I want to first create a budget. I want to estimate how much the job's going to cost me, the contractor, so I can use that to quote a price to the client. If we use advanced or simple, we start by quoting the price and we can set a budget later on, but now we're working backwards a little bit where we say, okay, we told the customer 10,000, so let's try our best to keep it under 9,000. Whereas professional lets us say, we expect it to cost us 10,000, so let's tell the customer that they have to pay us 15 to make sure we see the margin we want. I won't get too deep into the contract or the actual cost tracking side of this today. Again, what our webinar is really based on today is just the budgeting side, and that's where our deep dive is going to be. But we do cover all the other topics in future webinars. Budgeting is kind of the top of the order, so we'll be covering a lot more in the coming weeks. So when I start this new project, it pulls me into plan and track, which is where I build out my budget to Knowify. And I can build these by adding new phases. So I click add new phase. And the first thing I need to do is demolition. Now, every phase by default has a materials budget. This is our bare minimum option. And if I want to do lump sum budgeting, I can by saying materials budget, $2,000. Now, for any other category that's relevant to demolition, I can use this enable cost category to enable different budgets. For demolition, I will spend $4,000 on labor. For demolition, I'll hire a subcontractor for $3,000. I'll have equipment on site. It'll cost me $2,000. And there will be miscellaneous costs of $1,000. Now I have the individual category budgets for demolition and the overall budget. Demolition should cost me $12,000. Now you can see that the budget of the overall project is updating at the top of the screen too. Since I only have one phase, my budget is equal to the phase budget for the overall job. I'm going to save this and create another phase now so we can start exploring the concept of an itemized budget. I'll say framing. Now, again, I can always write in a figure here. I have that option. What I can do is use this add materials option and create an itemized budget for materials, where I could say I need to buy lumber. It can search through my catalog of products and services for lumber. I could say I'm buying these 2x4s. I need to buy 250 of them. And using the estimated unit cost from my catalog, now my budget for framing is $1,500. And I can enter everything that I need to buy. Here's some strand board. I need 150 sheets. Here's nails. That's way too many sheets. Here's my nails. I need 50 boxes. What I can also do, if I have something that I need to budget for on this job that's not in my catalog, I could just say miscellaneous widgets, and I need to buy 100 of these things for 742 each. We can put that in as well without it being part of the catalog, just so we can make sure it's part of our budget, even if it's not something that we are going to be buying often. This is just a budget for this specific project. And that's how we can use this itemized option. This can also be imported from a spreadsheet. We do a whole webinar on importing from spreadsheets if that's something that you guys are interested in. It'll be happening down the line. We also keep that posted on the webinar page. Now, when it comes to an itemized budget for labor, similar type of option here. I can add a new role or resource. And depending on our tier of Knowify, I can either choose the role. So I need a foreman for 40 hours. Or I can say specific people, I need Mike for 40 hours. And this is the difference. I can either budget for generically laborer, or I could say for Mike the laborer. So if I know it's him, I can put him in here and get a more accurate budget. But best chances are, if I'm just budgeting, I don't know who it's going to be. So I'll say I need laborers on site for 80 hours. Now, again, what this helps us do is now track the actual cost when our laborers track time. It's going to see how many actual hours we spent versus the 80 budgeted. When our foreman track time, how many hours did we spend versus the 40 budgeted. And you'll see that this hourly cost is coming in here, and it's a pretty fixed number. That's pretty flat looking, which is not always the most realistic to what our labor costing rates are. So I'm going to quickly jump to my rates and resources section and just show you that we have under roles and applicable rates, a billing rate, which is going to be how much we charge a customer if it's a time materials job, and a budget rate. And so I told Knowify that for laborer time, assume that it cost me 75. For foreman time, assume it cost me 90. If this is blank, and again, there's a difference between blank and zero. If I set it to zero, it's going to use zero. If it's blank, we'll just use the average of everyone in your resources page that has that tag. So for laborer, it's going to look at the average rate that we job cost for Mike and Laszlo and Eli, and API bot's not a real user, so we won't worry about that. But it's going to create that average, and that's what it's going to use instead. In a lot of places, that's okay. But I think there's something to be said about setting up a manual budget rate and maybe going a little over average, or maybe set your budget rate to the most it could possibly cost you. That way you have a better chance of staying on budget when you actually track if everything goes as expensive as it possibly can. That way, in the worst of scenarios, you're always covered. Now we'll get into subcontractor budgeting, which again, we can always lump sum. But what we can also do is add subcontractor work. So I can say that I'm going to need someone to come in and do drywall, and I'm probably going to pay my drywall person $2,000. I'll also need someone to do painting. I know this isn't really part of framing, but for the sake of example, and the painting person is going to cost me $5,000. So I can itemize out a budget for subcontractor work the same way that I do for materials here, in that I just put in the name of what I'm going to be budgeting and the total amount I'm going to end up spending on that service. We also have the option here to add a subcontractor. So if I already know who's going to be working on this, I could say Ernie's Electrical, and we could choose from our existing budgets. But basically, I can actually upload the subcontract if I need to. So we can use their actual subcontract, the actual amount they quoted us as the budget on this job. Now we'll get into our equipment budgeting. So I'll enable equipment as a category, and I'll come to equipment where I have internal and external. For internal, I have to set up some equipment in my account, so I'll get to that in a second. But for external, I could say I'm going to need to rent let's just say a dumpster. Perfect, it's in the catalog, and I'll need it for 14 days. And just like that, I can budget out something that I need to rent from other people. But again, for our internal equipment, what we could do is go to our equipment section in the admin section. I could say I need to budget for an excavator, This is my the addition of the excavator in my account here. Then under rates and resources, I could say the excavator costs me $100 an hour. And this is my actual costing rate. Again, this also gives us the ability to add this new role here where I could say when we estimate the cost of excavator, assume $120 an hour. And when we bill for it, we bill $200 an hour, things like that as we go. Now this is in here. When I go back to check on that job for the sake of budgeting, I have the option of setting up the budget by saying add internal equipment for either generically an excavator, which is 120, or I could say I know that I'm using excavator 364 on this one, and it'll be there for, let's also say 40 hours here. And now I have my budget for equipment. Now the last one here, our miscellanea category. Again, it's very similar to what we have with materials. This is where I could just say I need to buy a permit from the county office and they charge 133.23. And now that's part of my budget as well. And again, we can add as many of these as we want. So that's really our concepts of budgeting in Knowify, where we have our lump sum options, we have our itemized options. And I'm not going to, again, spend too much time on the proposal, but I just want to show you that when we create a proposal, since we use professional mode, I can now add a markup to those budgets and have that automatically generate a contract for me. So it's saying based off of your budgets and how you set this all up, you should quote 56,000 because if all goes according to plan, you should spend 37,000. It'll result in $18,000 in profit, which is a 33% margin. Now, I won't go too deep into how to track costs for the sake of this webinar, because again, we are really focusing more on the concept of budgeting. But I just want us to see how this is all going to be understood when we are actually tracking our cost versus budget. Because I could see at the top of the screen my total committed cost, which is 0 because we haven't tracked anything, and our total budget. And I could see it broken down into materials, labor, subs, equipment, miscellanea. And I can start just tracking this. So if I go to demolition, materials, I can just say, miscellaneous cost. And I can update cost, and now it's starting to give us a little bit more of a picture. Here's our material cost versus budget. It's our total cost versus budget, and I can see it at the demolition level in particular. Now, when it comes to labor, again, we can be entering time. And this is going to be for the demolition phase, 8 hours of Charles's time, submit. But then if we get to the framing, I'll enter some time for just about everyone here. And we'll get that equipment in there too, just so we can see how that's all going to work. Now, as this is submitted, again, we'll be able to see this in a couple different ways. We'll see the overall labor cost, which is taking a second to update there. But then I'll also see on demolition, here is the 8 foreman hours spent. Now it shows me $668 spent out of 4,000 budgeted, and it shows me that it's all foreman hours and it's all Charles hours right now. But you'll see that there's no hours budgeted against because we just created a lump sum budget of $4,000 here. If I go to my framing, this is going to give me a little bit more granular detail because I took the time to build a more granular budget. So yes, I see 4,500 spent out of 9,600 budgeted, but I also can see how much of that was laborer, how much of it was foreman, who were the individual laborers and foremen that were on, how much did we spend on their time. I could get this more detailed information. So if I'm creating a budget again in the future, I don't necessarily need to know that it costs me $4,500 worth of labor. What I want to know is that it takes 24 hours of laborer time and 32 hours of foreman time. Because as these people have new rates in the future, I want to be able to budget those types of hours. I want to be able to understand as the rate that we budget for changes, the number of hours might stay the same unless there's a pretty big advancement in how labor is going to be executed on site. And that's where these itemized budgets start coming into handy for labor. You'll see that under our equipment, same idea. We've spent $800 on equipment out of 5,400 budgeted. 8 hours of the excavator out of 40. It was all excavator 364. And then again, my numbers are taking a second to update. I just need to refresh, but that's the general idea here. Now, I also mentioned that having an itemized budget for materials makes it easier to track the cost of materials. And that's because I could do some things where I could see this says not ordered. I could just click an item and say allocate materials and basically tell Knowify, hey, add that cost to the job now. It's no longer a budget, it's an actual. But I can also say create purchase and select the items that I want to purchase. And Knowify will automatically start building a purchase order for me from ABC Supply. I can make adjustments here as I need, but I can also just quickly submit this. It generates my purchase order and it updates my cost versus budget. So I can see that I've ordered 250 out of 250 budgeted, and this was the purchase order it was on. So I start getting all of that information of how much we actually spent versus what we set up as our budget. Um, and that's going to update in real time with everything else. So again, I won't go too deep into the weeds with our actual costing. But if I were to log a bill here and put in the final values of some of these items, the bill takes precedent over the purchase order. So we have the most recent cost, but I can see my new cost versus budget for materials. And I can see 3,500 spent out of 3,700 budgeted. That gives us just an update on where we stand on this job right now. Now, when it comes to subcontractors, we get a couple extra fields here. So I'm going to add a subcontractor, architects for drywall. I guess why not? And I could say they ended up quoting me $2,500 and submit their contract here. And this is going to end up creating a purchase order for that subcontractor. And I'll be able to start locking my bills. So I could say out of that 2,500, they've billed me for 1,500 of it. Now, I guess last thing here, we'll put in a bill payment. Again, I'm trying not to focus too much on the actual costing, but I just wanted to see how the budget is going to be tracked and managed here. So I can now see that for subcontractors, we've spent 2,500 out of 7,000 that was budgeted. Archie's Architects has a contract value of 2,500, of which they've billed us for 1,500, of which we've paid 500. And so that just gives us that breakdown that tells us a little bit more about where we stand on this job at any point in time. Then for external equipment, we're going to be tracking this again, and this actually applies to miscellaneous as well. These categories are tracked very similar to materials, where we can create purchase orders, we can create expenses, things like that. But now I want to get a little bit into the difference between creating a vendor purchase order for material versus equipment versus miscellaneous. And again, we always do a webinar that's specific to tracking vendor costs, where I'll get into a little bit more detail on this. But I always like to mention it in this webinar just because it's part of the categorization and these different concepts here. So what makes a difference here, because I can create a purchase for this dumpster rental, and I can choose any vendor from my list. But there's going to be cases like ABC Supply, I'm actually buying materials from, where we also have equipment rental, which is going to be costed as equipment rental. And it's based off of who the vendor is. So I'll submit this, and we have the ability to now see the change in cost for the external equipment. But this is all based off of the classification of the vendor. So if I come in here and I say, look at my equipment rental vendor, I edit, you can see that every vendor has a type where now it knows that if I create a cost for equipment rental as the vendor, it knows to go to equipment, but I can also set it to material, subcontractor, miscellaneous, and that's going to be how we categorize these different expenses once they make it to the cost. This is how it knows what budget to go against. I mostly just bring this up because we could find ourselves in a situation where I say equipment, create purchase. I'll even do the dumpster rental again, just for the sake of example here. And then I'll choose a vendor, ABC Supply, who's actually a material vendor. Now, even though I created this by coming in from that create purchase button on the equipment, it knows that ABC Supply is a material vendor, so it still costs this. The actual cost still files under materials. And that's kind of the difference of how we track these things. This is how we get that actual versus budgeted categorized is based off of the vendor itself. What I also have here now is a budget that's gone over. So I spent 4,500 actual cost out of 3,700 budgeted. You can see the bar has turned red here, whereas with labor, it's still blue and showing me I'm under budget on this category of this phase. Last one here, pretty similar to what we've done in the past, but I could say create purchase for this permit. I'll do a cash one because why not? Miscellaneous vendor, submit. And again, since miscellaneous vendor is categorized as miscellaneous, it knows to update that. And here's where we get the power of Knowify. This is what we always like to be able to offer. I can look at this job and see I've spent $15,344.27 so far. And I can also see it broken down into materials, labor, subs, equipment, and miscellanea. And I can see how much we budgeted for the overall job, and I can see how much I budgeted for each category. Then I can also see the cost versus budget of each phase of the job. Demolition cost me $2,100 out of my $12,000 budget. Framing cost me $13,000 out of my $25,000 budget. But then I can even drill further down where I now say, okay, show me my framing material cost versus budget, labor cost versus budget, etc. Then I can drill further down and say, okay, inside materials, how much did I spend on lumber? Did I buy more or less or the same amount expected? Did I spend more or less or the same amount as I expected? So we can start high level. I've spent 15,000, a little bit less than half of my budget, and then drill all the way down into this nitty-gritty detail of I did spend more than expected on strand board on this project, and here was the purchase order and the corresponding bill. And I could say, yeah, we spent 4,500 on labor, but here's how much was spent on individual employees. Again, my numbers always take a second to update when I have Zoom open, but here's how much was spent on individual employees, on individual types of employee, and here's how many hours it takes. So this way, if I need to do a similar project, I could say, well, at least I know how long it takes, however much I end up paying my employees at that point in time. And so that's really what we get with as far as the power of Knowify goes when we think about the high level, where do we stand? And then the nitty gritty, what did I spend on this specific material on this specific phase of this job? And then past that, we'll also be able to run different types of reports. So I can say, create a P&L report. We'll generate an Excel file that'll show us the cost versus budget and the resulting variance at any point in time to just give us a little bit more information on this. And here's what this report looks like. Here's the revenue side of it, which we're not worried about right now. But then I can get this P&L that says you told me labor was going to be 4,000 for demolition. So far, it's been 600. That's a variance of $3,331, et cetera, et cetera. And I can just get that reporting really quick based off of the different information in Knowify. And we have a bunch of other reports that are involved in this as well. I highly recommend going through the reports section and taking a look at this, just running the different ones that tell you what you're looking for. But this will also give us a percentage of completion of each of these phases, and I should specify a percentage of cost versus budget for each of these phases, which could end up being useful in your progress billing with time. I think that's just about everything I wanted to cover. I guess one last thing that I like to mention, I mentioned this during the slide deck, but let's say the scope of work has changed now, and this project is expected to cost me more money. I can always switch this to budget mode, and I can make an adjustment to the budget if I want. I could say demolition materials will now be 3,000, but I also can add more phases. So if I could say additional scope of work, I now need to buy 2,000 more in materials and 4,000 more in labor. I can make this adjustment and track all of this separately so I can see the original cost versus budget from the phases that I set up initially, and then I could see the additional cost versus budget if I need to track that separately in the future, if I have a similar job and I want to see how this went. Was this additional scope of work just something that I hadn't considered, or is it something that was requested after the fact, and is it tied into a change order, things like that? Um, and you can also use change orders to generate these types of things. So if I want to create a can light installation as part of this, my change order is live and I have this breakdown of materials and everything here. Um, once this is active, I can say create phase and plan automatically, and it'll generate a phase and budget for can light installation, which can add to my scope of work. And that's a nice little time saver that I always like to show, because if you are adding to the revenue scope, then you want to add to your budget scope and see how they play off of each other. Um, Again, that's all I wanted to go through for the demonstration here. We have just about 20 minutes scheduled left, so I'm going to pull up the Q&A and see if there's anything that I can do a little bit of a deeper dive in for you guys. Um, So the first question was about locking the original budget and then changing it with time. For what it's worth, there is going to be with time the option of essentially snapshotting the budget. Here was the budget at this point in time, and here's the new budget, so that you can see original budget versus current budget. We don't have an exact time frame or feature set that's planned here, but that is something that we've been discussing internally and will likely be adding with time. And if it's something that you want to chat with us about, by all means, please reach out to me. I'm happy to learn a little bit more about how you'd like to see this function. But until then, you can always add the additional phase and track that separately from everything else. Um, there's a question about sales tax capabilities, which I'm not sure is relevant to budgeting. It says we're only calculating sales tax on sale price, so on invoices. Um, we likely will start looking into feature sets as far as it pertains to budgeting, to be able to budget for the amount of tax paid. So you can put in the number of or the value of a budget item, and it should be able to provide you with how much you should end up paying in tax. It's in the roadmap. Again, no projected date, but again, if you want to reach out to us and talk a little bit more about what you want that feature to look like, by all means, never be shy about sending an email to support or to me personally, or you can always use the feedback engine in Knowify, which again, this lets you track the status of different things you've submitted as well. Um, Is there a report showing budgeted labor hours against actual hours and dollars? Really good question. So a couple options here. One of the maybe easiest ones you can run would be your backlog report. The backlog report is going to be similar to some of the other advanced jobs reports and things like that we have around the system. But this shows me contract value, the amount unbilled, but then it also breaks down budgeted hours, tracked hours, and backlog. So I could see here's a job where I budgeted 140 hours. I've spent 56, so there's 84 hours remaining expected on this job. Another neat option for tracking actual versus budgeted for uh, different jobs is I can use my phases report. Um, and this phases report actually will break down labor hours committed, estimated, and then it'll also show me costs. So I can also filter this out, but you see labor costs, labor budget, and then I'll see total hours committed, hours estimated. And this is at the phase level. So, man, I have too many phases in my account that don't have budgets. Um, so let me actually filter this. Project name is 141. So here's the project that I just built. It has the framing phase in which it can tell me here is the number of hours committed, the number of hours estimated, equipment hours committed versus estimated. and then the resulting cost versus budget of labor as well, labor cost, labor budget. So I recommend this one too if you're okay with doing some of your own filtering for individual jobs. If you calculate the overhead as a percentage of revenue, how do you suggest one input overhead budget and apply the cost? So, um, this is a good question. So, I think it's worth mentioning. When we talk about job costing, we really are trying to consider hard cost of job. So, although your revenue, your markup should include the amount that you'll end up spending in overhead. It shouldn't be something that you're budgeting for because then you're actually somewhat charging for it twice. The idea is whatever the markup that you put in on your contract, your budget, then add the markup. It should be that the resulting profit of the job is enough to cover the overhead as well. Mostly just because overhead is by definition not job specific, right? It's something that doesn't go to the job. So we're now talking about trying to divvy up how much overhead goes to which job, which can be a little bit abstract. There's a percentage base of how much time one job takes versus the other on administrative time. So in general, we shouldn't be trying to track overhead as job cost because it kind of goes outside of the concept of job costing and it focuses a little bit more on something that um, is more company-wide reporting. How much did I totally spend beyond just jobs, totally everything I spend as a company in this year? How much did I make? The amount of income is probably going to be pretty job specific, but again, the overhead should be something that's tracked either in your internal projects if you need to track it in Knowify, or more of just a QuickBooks or accounting solution type of tracking, so I could see total cost outside of jobs as well. Um, There's a question about budgeting for time and materials job to give the customer an estimated cost. Um, uh, One thing I would recommend looking into for this, and it's something that you could definitely look into for if you want to check out our time and material or cost plus webinars. But we have an option here, cost plus with schedule values invoicing, which is essentially the idea of creating a time and material contract where you are being transparent with the customer about your cost versus budget. Um, Now, what I mean by that, and I won't go too deep into the detail on this, but what I mean is that we'll be able to create a proposal where we say, here's our work. And then I can write in the budget for the customer to see. I usually pay my workers $75 an hour. I think it'll take me 100 hours. Here's what I'm going to need to buy, materials, um, whatever it's going to be, $100 per material, whatever that means, 100 materials. So now I have something that tells me that the job should cost me $17,500, and then I can add my markup and profit, where I could say overhead and profit should be on this job 50%. Now, what's nice about this workflow is it's still going to use a time and materials type of uh, a contract, and that I need to incur cost in order to um, invoice my customer. But now I can have a budget that's functional for me, this 10,000, 7,500, but it's also functional for the customer. So as I incur more cost, this pulls over to the contract and then my invoices. So I can now invoice my customer and display on that schedule values invoice the cost versus budget and then the amount that we're charging as well. So just to show you what that looks like, I can see we quoted a budget of 17,500. So far, we've spent 1,020, and then there's our margin of 50%. So here's the amount you're paying. So if you need to have a budget that's relevant to both you and the customer, that would probably be the best approach for you. There's a request for new items coming. We don't have too much that we can announce on this webinar, but we do have some pretty big features that should be launched this month. We'll have separate webinars and announcements about that, but if you have more questions about that, reach out separately. We can probably discuss offline for those. There's a question about adding change orders to the original budget. So that's kind of what I covered with the concept of creating a change order and then you can pull it into the budget. So if I create a change order, use service templates to speed up the process. Once this is live, basically it's going to take these cost values from before markup. And then I can use this create phase and plan automatically to build that budget in for the amount changed here. And then there's another question on auto-populating approved change orders in the budget. Again, that's the same workflow. Again, we'll see that phase automatically shows up. There's a question about uploading receipts or invoices. That goes outside of budgeting, but yes, when you enter a purchase or a bill, you always have the option of uploading the document. So I could say upload supporting documents here. Is there a published format that we can see for setting up our Excel spreadsheets, upload to Knowify? Absolutely. If we go to our demonstrations webinar page, which we can email to any of you guys who are interested in, you'll see that we have importing spreadsheet data into Knowify. That can be a really informative way to learn a little bit more about how to get that stuff into Knowify. There's a question about how do we handle forecasting using the budget? So I guess it kind of depends what you mean by forecasting, but using that P&L report, you can get outstanding amount, so the amount that hasn't been spent yet, the variance at any point in time. But we also will use the budget to track WIP at any point in time. So if I look at this project, it's showing that I've earned $19,000 worth of revenue in WIP. Now, what does that mean? Essentially, it's comparing percentages, our cost versus budget percentage. So 15,000 spent versus $45,000 budgeted to the amount of the contract. So I can click on this WIP number and see the total cost of the job was budgeted at $4,500, or sorry, $45,000. So far, we've spent 15,000, which is 33% of the budget. This means that even though I haven't invoiced yet, I should be able to invoice $19,000 because that's 33.4% of the contract. So if I go to this job now and I invoice and I say, I want to invoice, let's round it up to 40%. My change orders will throw off my numbers here. Cool. Now my WIP is negative. So it's saying, yes, I have invoiced $22,000, but I have not spent a large enough percentage to justify that. So I should subtract $2,900 from my revenue as a forecast. So I've spent 33% of the budget. I've invoiced 38% of the contract value because it's 40% original plus the change orders. And that's where the variance comes into play. And so using the WIP number, we can kind of better understand potential profit and future profit as it pertains to cost versus budget tracking. I hope that helps. Is it easy to send out a weekly or monthly Excel sheet to show project manager that we're on track? I'd say one thing that could be pretty handy. Again, we covered the concept of downloading P&L reports from here. And then if you need to email it quickly out of Knowify, one option you have would be to use the RFIs or submittals. And you could just say, send this updated budget, send to Terrin. Please see updated budget and let me know if you have questions. And then I'm going to just drag that P&L here and I can send it out. So, although it's not an automatic way to send these things, it is just a nice way that we can, uh, somewhat quickly send out a document or a report to someone through Knowify. Um, it's not, again, very automated, but you can see that I could get that done in just about 1 minute worth of work in Knowify. Um, We are running short on time and have a lot of other questions that came in. I'm sorry I didn't answer more through the original webinar, but the if you have more questions I can't get to before the end of our hour here, again, feel free to reach out to support@novi.com or your success manager for more training and questions. Um, There's a question about the phases report only supporting active jobs. We can definitely put in feedback to have this include closed jobs. I think a lot of the times it's just a matter of how much data is pulled at any point in time. So we'd probably need to apply some more filtering to that. But again, don't be shy about submitting that type of thing into our feedback engine so we can uh, look a little bit deeper into that. Um, And the rest of them, I don't think I can answer inside the 4 minutes we have left. So again, if you want to go deeper into it, it looks like two questions again about overhead cost, which I completely understand. Wanted to chat more about that. Please, don't be shy about reaching out to support or to your success manager so we can set up training sessions and go into a little bit more detail about how you want to manage this because you always have different options. Um, uh, you always have different options of setting up budgets based off of how you want to do it, right? There's no limit. There's nothing stopping you from adding overhead items to a budget or adding an extra phase to a budget specifically for overhead. We can cover all that type of stuff. It's just the default functionality, again, isn't quite the same thing, but just some things to consider there. Um, and then another question was about templating. We do a whole webinar on templating and setting up uh, uh, templates, budget templates. And we're happy to send you direct links to this stuff and the link to our resources page. It's just knowify.com/resources, and you can get access to all of our previous webinars. But again, that's just about the time we have today. I really do appreciate everyone joining in and for coming in with really thoughtful, good questions here. If you have further questions that we didn't get a chance to answer, by all means, please reach out to our support team at support@novi.com, or you can talk to your success manager and set up training. And if there's anything that you need clarification from me on, never be shy about reaching out. I'm always happy to help. Thanks everyone again, and I hope you have a great rest of your week.